and welcome inside the Palace Castle for yet another episode of Historia Mystoria. I am, of course, your host, as always, Mr. Professor Sponseller, and I'm so glad that you've joined us once again. And guys, we're getting ready to start my favorite historical time period. The reasons why we get to the American Revolution, the pre-revolutionary period. I love talking about everything from what we're going to be talking about today, which is the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, and getting into the French and Indian War, and talking about the king's problems with the colonies and the colonies' problems with the king, and talking about all the acts. And that's what we're going to be talking about here during this scenario. And we're going to start off today by talking about sermons of raw emotion. We're going to talk about the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Now, we've talked about this before in prior scenarios where religion had started to kind of fade off in the colonies. They were more worried about, finding work and making money. And it seemed like the whole reason why this country or the colonies was founded in the first place, which was, of course, religion, it's kind of gone to the back burner, that people weren't really thinking about religion as much, and it was causing a societal problem in a lot of these colonies. And so today we're going to take a look at this movement known as the Great Awakening, and then we'll talk about in part two, the Enlightenment. So let's go ahead and get started here with the lesson today, and we're going to start off with the Great Awakening. And it was a movement between the years of 1730 and 1740. So yes, we're going to kind of ahead in history here. We're from where we left off in scenario 4. But I want you to understand that it was a shared national religious experience. Remember, before, we've been talking about how all of these 13 colonies had typically been individualistic, that they really didn't work with one another, and they didn't have the same ideas, and they didn't do the same things. Some farmed, some had the fur trade, some timbered. And so it wasn't like they had this big experience that was shared, where we could consider this nation that we're going to be having later on as one. For right now, we were still, 13 individualized colonies. But this was going to bring the first ever shared national experience, and it was going to be under the umbrella of religion. And so let's take a look at what was the reasons why this movement took place in the first place. Well, people were feeling that religion was outdated. It was dry, dull, distant. It was the same thing over and over and over again. And people were tired of that. They wanted something new, wanted something fresh. And there were preachers a lot of times that felt that people needed to be concerned with their inner emotions as opposed to their religious behavior. And so a lot of times, again, religion took a back seat to a lot of the things that were happening in the colonies. The first man we're going to talk about here, who was a part of the movement, was a Puritan minister by the name of George Whitefield. We're going to talk about two specifically today, but this one, he used raw emotion. So he used what he was. He told you this is how it was and this is how it's going to be. And he would reach a whole spectrum of colonists, not just those who were able to read the Bible, all right, those who people were able to understand it the correct way. He was able to reach every single person so that everyone could understand it. He preached the big message that good works and living a godly life would bring you salvation, and that if you did these things, then you as a citizen of these colonies would be successful. It got to be such an important message as he traveled around that he was forced to give these sermons in open areas, these big, huge, like theater-style places where people were outside and they were kneeling to pray and they were hallelujahing and all these different things. We know these things as revivals today. That's what this was like. And so really George Whitefield kind of got off on the right foot going here. And then the person that's going to kind of mimic him, Jonathan Edwards, probably the one that's more known. Not did he just teach the message, but he terrified his listeners who were listening to his sermons. His big sermon was called "The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He was saying that, God's going to do this to you if you don't start acting the way you're supposed to, if you don't go to church, if you don't do this, if you don't do that, if your religion is not at the forefront of your life. And so he said that we don't want to make God angry. And so he was terrifying these people to literally put religion back at the front of their lives. So what was the big outcome of the Great Awakening and all these sermons that we've talked about with Whitefield and now Jonathan Edwards? Well, there was a birth of deep religious conviction. It got to the point where no one was really caring about religion to where it went back to the number one core ideal and value for these colonists in the New World. and new churches were being built because there were a lot of members, and so a lot of the churches that were there were too small, and so they started building these big, elaborate churches to accommodate all these new members. And then, of course, you had people who wanted to be ministers. You know, that these ministers were being looked up to, and there were younger people and even older folk who wanted to become ministers and teach the word to other people. And so there were colleges that were founded to train ministers and to really bring education to the forefront as well. It occurs the idea of equality and the right to challenge authority. We know in the Bible that equality was big, you know, in the New Testament, and it seemed like in the colonies that equality wasn't there. We weren't really talking so much about the slavery issue here, but equality for the colonists as a whole throughout. And keep that in mind, as this is going to play a major role as we move forward into the king's issues with the colonists and the colonists' issue with the king. Now we're going to move on to the second movement here, known as the Enlightenment, a completely different scientific or more scientific idea of religion, in the fact that this movement rejected the traditional ways of life and looked for a scientific or rationale way to explain the world we live in. So you have the one side of the flip of the coin, where you have religion, and now you've got really this scientific way of looking at things, of saying this is why the earth is the way it is, this is why the people the way they are, because of scientific reasons. And so that was used a little bit differently than the Great Awakening, but again, it was the same movement in the way that they're going to try and really get a bunch of people on board. And so some of the arguments for Enlightenment were that generally we are good, and it's the environment that influenced us, that the use of science could answer all of life's mysteries, like why is the sky blue, why is water clear, things like that. Science could also answer questions concerning government, and that's what's most important here. The Great Awakening really brought about the argument about what was true government. What would we really want to have as a government in the colonies? We're not talking about America yet. We're not talking about rebellion. We're not talking about the American Revolution. But this is all planting the foundation into people's minds, especially when King George III starts all of his taxation here in the colonies. And so some of the outcomes of the Enlightenment were a great surge of literacy. People wanted to learn how to read, and people were not just reading the Bible, but people who were putting out these pamphlets and these scientific ideas, people were looking into them, reading into them. Newspapers and book publications increased because of that, because people wanted to put down into words what they believed. Schools became synonymous with towns and villages. Not only did they teach religion, but they also taught sciences. They taught reading and writing and how to understand things. And they preached that deism, that God was the great clockmaker, that everything went through God. And the biggest one here that was big, and we're going to talk about if we move forward here into the reasons of the American Revolution, but people were born with natural rights. Government had an obligation to protect those natural rights. And the biggest one here is that there were people who were members of the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment, who believed that the king should have no right to govern people. That if we want a government to work, then the people should choose the government and the people should empower that government. And so for the first time here in the colonies, we see people who are in a complete disagreement with the way things are working out in England. Now remember that these people are English. They are not going to go against Crown and Country. And if they're going to do whatever they possibly can to avoid some type of conflict with England, because they know that they don't stand a chance. They want to be English. Again, why would you want to not be a part of the greatest empire in the world? It's not like these people wanted to get rid of that. It's the way that they were being treated. And if you can think about that, amongst your own lives, if something keeps happening to you over and over and over and you feel that it's unfair, you're eventually going to get to a snapping point and something is going to happen. And this is just a foundation. We're really talking about this over this scenario. But think about all of the problems. That's the biggest thing I want you to think about during this scenario, is how many things did these colonists have to deal with, not just from England, but amongst themselves in their own colonies, to where everyone's got a boiling point, everyone's got a breaking point, and that is what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this scenario. So I hope you learned something a little bit about the two movements of the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment here this evening. Make sure that you complete all the assignments and quests that go along with this, especially on Nomia. And remember that the biggest things you have to understand from this are obviously the outcomes of the Enlightenment, outcomes of the Great Awakening, and some of the reasons of what caused us to get to this movement in the first place. Well, that'll wrap up tonight's episode here of Historia Mystoria. I hope, again, you learned something very valuable as we move forward into the American Revolution. Until next time, you have to click on my YouTube page or here inside of the scenario class. I'm Professor Sponseller, and I'll see you next week here on Historia Mystoria. Good night.